Hi there, and welcome to Plant CEO. In today's episode, we have Nir Goldstein, the Managing Director of the Good Food Institute in Israel. Hey Nir, how are you?
Hey, thanks so much for having me. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Great to have you on the show. You're currently in the northern part of Israel. Whereabouts are you exactly?
Wow, I'm about an hour north of Tel Aviv.
Awesome. So, amongst other things, we're going to be talking about a new report that you've just released, which is the Israel State of Alternative Protein Innovation Report 2021. And I'll definitely include that report in the show notes. But can you start by telling me what the GFI is, the Good Food Institute, and how it's organized in the different countries?
Sure, yeah. So GFI, the Good Food Institute, we're an international non-profit organization, and we are working for a very simple cause. We are trying to make alternative proteins no longer alternative. We want to put them on the table for families and individuals around the globe, making sure that we have a healthier food system that is more sustainable and humane. We are located around the world with our main branch is in the US. Most of our staff is over there, about 70. And then we have about 60 more people with our affiliates around the globe. We have people in Brazil, in Europe, in India, Asia Pacific, and here in tiny Israel.
Awesome. And it was founded by Bruce, right?
Yeah, Bruce Friedrich co-founded it in 2016, so about 5 years ago now. And we grew from a few very visionary individuals to about, as I mentioned, about 120 now.
So something that you touched on the report also is around what's happening in the global space around alternative proteins. And, you know, looking at the stats in the last decade, there's been around 6 billion that has actually been invested. And if you're sort of breaking that down from the different numbers, last year, I think it was 2.1 billion that went to plant-based meat, egg and dairy. That was 3x from 2019. Fermentation companies was 590 million. That's 2x. And cultivated meat companies was 360 million. That's 6x. So that area is also growing really a lot. So what do you believe has led this, first of all, global growth?
That's a very difficult question to really answer. I think there are so many different factors that combine into this trend that we are seeing with alternative proteins. But first of all, you can't argue with the facts. For the past few years, we've seen significant growth, and I'm sure that with the forecast in the coming decade, we will see an even more rapid growth. By 2030, we expect that alternative proteins will account for about 10% of the global protein market. To put this into context, the global food industry is about $10 to $12 trillion annual at size. Out of this, protein, meaning meat and other products that are derived from animals, account for about $2 trillion. So when we talk about 10% of the market, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and that's the trajectory. When we talk about, try to guess what are the reasons behind alternative proteins, I think it's one of those things that really click for so many different reasons. I think above everything, sustainability is the major cause to attract the broader audiences of consumers. About a third of Americans are now looking for alternatives as them being flexitarians. So it's not only the vegans and vegetarians of the world, but I think the majority of the population who wants to consume alternative proteins are flexitarians, as you know when you're nodding. And I mentioned sustainability. We are now seeing governments like the Biden administrations and others around the world understand the very difficult situation that humanity has to deal with nowadays with regard to the climate crisis. We understand that it's a very serious situation where we're at, and we have to deal with it. And food and animal-derived proteins specifically are accountable for so many challenges that humanity has to deal with, from over 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions that are derived by animal agriculture. It is the #1 user of fresh water, the #1 cause for deforestation in the Amazon, and antimicrobial resistance, and I can go further and further. So I think it's, on the one hand, the consumption demand, on the other hand, alternative protein clicking everything with regards to the challenges that humanity has to face. I think those are the main reasons behind why we are seeing the alternative protein industry booming in recent years, and for the forecast that we are seeing.
Yeah, and let's also think about the land usage, right? Incredible amount of land that's being used on our earth just to raise the animals, but also to grow the feed for those animals, which just doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make any sense. You know, we can go for an hour and a half talking only about the reasons behind why alternative proteins are so important with regards to land and in usage of our very precious resources. We now know that to create 1 calorie out of a cow, it takes 25 calories of feed that we need to feed the cow. This is why we use about 70% of the land, agricultural land, to create the food for our animal-derived protein. It's very inefficient. But when we talk about alternative proteins, like cultivated meat and plant-based foods, they are more efficient by more than 95% with regards to animal-derived proteins across various measures of sustainability and resource use. So it's land, it's water, it's energy, all about them.
Yeah, and thinking about Israel, Israel's always been very advanced on agricultural processes, especially around irrigation, and some of those technologies have been taken up by different countries. So let's talk specifically about Israel. It's also been a massive hub for innovation and R&D, and you cover some of those stats in your report. And me personally, most of my day job is actually in marketing, and so I've actually worked with Israeli companies, especially in the ad tech space. And today I actually work with a company called Perion, which has a company called Undertone and Code Fuel. So these are innovation hubs for marketing technology. How would you say does R&D differ from other leading countries that also invest heavily in R&D?
I think for Israel, we have no choice but to focus on R&D. We are a very tiny country. We have almost no natural resources, or we haven't had any for the past decades since we were independent. And I think the high-tech sector is accountable for about 30% of the Israeli GDP nowadays. Israel is often referred to as startup nation in recent years. And the causes for this are again, different and hard to account for, but I think we can take a look at different factors, like the fact that Israel has the most academic educated people per capita in the world. We have a very high rate of government capital invested in R&D worldwide, with about 4% of GDP. We have an advantage for the fact that we are very concentrated geographically. So in Israel, you can walk in one street in the city south of Tel Aviv and visit about 20 alternative protein startups within a day by just walking.
Oh, wow.
So the fact that we are small and we have all of the different universities in Israel dealing with the very different causes and areas of research that you need in order to create an alternative protein ecosystem, those are all significant factors that create the Israeli advantage.
In terms of the GFI, you've also given some grants to these universities. Is that correct?
Yeah, so GFI gives an annual grant for for research of cultivated and plant-based meats worldwide. In Israel, we've been lucky to deploy 7 grants today, dealing with all sorts of research from leading universities. Israel has several universities in the world's top 100 research centers, from the Technion in Haifa, where we have research dealing with algae, to the Hebrew University, where we are doing some things with traditional fermentation and plant-based meats, to the Tel Aviv University, where we are dealing with cultivated meat, so really all around the country. And also here in Northern Israel, we are financing a research that has to do with quinoa and its possible uses as a source of plant-based protein for the industry.
Nice, yeah. Got to love the quinoa.
Yeah, and also I think one of the most exciting things that we've done here in Israel as GFI, we have written the world's first alternative protein R&D course in the Israel Academy. We are giving it in 5 universities to date here in Israel, all around the countries, and we are educating about 200 students a year in a first of its kind course that allows them to see all the different technologies going on with alternative proteins, that you can't get this knowledge elsewhere in the academy, because you can study maybe some things about cultivated meat or fermentation or plant-based, but nowhere else can you get an understanding of how the 3 intercombine into making food.
Have you thought about taking that course virtually, so maybe even other countries can, or other students elsewhere can access it?
Yeah, we're working on it with GFI nowadays, making it the whole course into short 20-minute clips, and I think it will be up on our website in a few months. And we're also sending our materials around the world for leading universities to be able to give the course themselves, and we are expecting next year to have the course given in Brazil, Singapore, the US, and the Netherlands.
That's really great, because I think that's also part of the barriers, that we don't have enough scientists that are really developing their skills for this particular challenge, right? And also in other countries where they don't have this focus, it just won't have that innovation coming out of it. So we definitely want to start to encourage this more.
Yeah, I think a lot of the quality, innovation and entrepreneurship that we see in alternative protein is derived from academic research. Here in Israel, we have mapped all of the relevant academic labs for alternative protein research. We reached about 300 academic labs. Out of them, fairly are actively researching the field, which is encouraging on the one hand to see so much research coming out of Israel, but we also see how much potential we have. And 300 is only in life sciences. If we take into account other fields that we want to see inside the field, like mechanical engineering, for example, or AI, or other fields that we need to continue the research in, then we have a ton of opportunity. Yeah,
for sure. So one of the great things that you did in December 2020 was that you managed to get the Prime Minister.
יש פה קופסאות עם הרבה מאוד מבחנות, בכל מבחנה יש כמה מיליונים של תאים, ובמבחנה כזאת בעצם שאנחנו רואים כאן, אנחנו יכולים להכיל את האוכלוסייה של כל מדינת ישראל ככזאת מבחנה.
כן. איפה השף? אני מאוד מתרגש.
האמת שזה באמת יום מרגש.
לא יאומן. ובמימד אחד חשוב, אני מאוד מאוד נרגש, לא האמנתי שהדבר הזה אפשרי. האמת, לא האמנתי. אני חייב להגיד לכם גם שזה מאוד מרגש אותי, אני ראש הממשלה הראשון שאוכל דבר.
ראש ממשלה הראשון, יום היסטורי, הטכנולוגיה הזו היא משהו שמעסיק את כל העולם, זה הנושא החם ביותר בפודטק, ואתה היום פורץ דרך כמו בהרבה דברים אחרים.
איך אתה, ראש הממשלה?
אפשר לקבל חצי מנה?
לדרך, טייק אווי.
מחר זה יום, אם נטו בכנסת, נכון? היום הבינלאומי.
יום זכויות בעלי חיים שאנחנו מציינים בכנסת.
אז המצב הזה שהאנושות מגדלת חיות ואחר כך כדי להרוג אותן, וחלק מהחיות האלה יש להן תובנות, קוגניציה. וגם רגשות. לפעמים אין ברירה, אבל כשיש לך את הברירה ומייצרים כאן את הברירה, זה דבר מאוד מאוד משמעותי לדעתי. דבר שיש לו השלכות באמת ארוכות טווח, ואני פשוט קודם כל גאה בכם שאתם עוסקים בזה, ואני מתכוון לעזור לכם. אני חושב שמדינת ישראל צריכה להיות מובילה במהלך הזה. היום זה יום שני, ממש meatless Monday.
תודה רבה, ראש הממשלה.
So, and he was the first head of state to try cultivated meat. So I just want to know a really important question. Did he get one of his minions to basically try it first before he did?
I think that, I can tell you, but then I'll have to, and I'm kidding, but I'm not sure I can share the Prime Minister's security arrangements. I can say it was a very, very exciting day. I didn't sleep for a week. And actually before the tasting, I think the more, maybe even more exciting opportunity that I had an hour to present the Prime Minister with our activities and our plan for a national policy plan for Israel, for it to become a global leader and maintain its leadership in alternative protein research, innovation, and industrial manufacturing for the coming years. And following that presentation, the Prime Minister decided to appoint a coordinator for our cause within the government. And ever since then, we've been working with the government to facilitate this plan. So we're at the amazing place where we don't longer have to convince anyone in the government. We have the Prime Minister's support, and we are working with the executive branch to deploy plans to target the specific gaps that we see in the Israeli market to allow for even more scientific research and innovation, and also for the creation of an advanced manufacturing ecosystem here in Israel. Obviously, with food, the industrial manufacturing has to happen relatively close to the end market. So we don't see Israel as a global manufacturing hub, but we do see it in a way, first of all, as a research and innovation hub, creating startups. Then we understand that we can be able to serve the relatively close geographical area with end products manufacturing from here in Israel. For instance, the biggest Israeli food manufacturer, Tnuva, have signed a deal to export foods to the UAE to begin with. And we also have products going all the way to Europe, to London. And to the larger extent, we understand that in Israel, we can create an industry of advanced manufacturing, allowing, for instance, in the world of cultivated meat, for the specific cells to be developed here in Israel, and then we can ship them to the other side of the world, be China, it can be the US, for them to be put into a bioreactor and grow into the end product. And we can do the same with fermentation and plant-based foods. So this is our vision for how Israel can continue building itself in this booming industry. And what we've presented the Prime Minister is with the gaps that the government need to work on tackling with regards to one, financing and infrastructure for scientific research, which is always in need. Two, infrastructure for scale up. We now see that Israeli startups can exist in Israel only until a certain stage, or they have to leave to Europe, China, or the US for them to have infrastructure to manufacture at scale. And also regulation, which is the global struggle of the alternative protein ecosystem. It's widely known with regards to cultivated meat, which country will be the first to allow the sale of it. And we now see Singapore is taking the lead. We hope Israel will be second.
Yeah, so I think that's really an important point for a lot of the cell-based meats, that they get that regulation. And have they earmarked a certain amount that they're on the finance side willing to invest as the government themselves? And I know we'll come to the Israel Innovation Authority in a minute, but and their funds, but have they just said, look, we're willing to put X amount towards this this new innovation?
So this is, it's a process. It takes a while. It's not like the prime minister can take out his wallet and say, let's pay this amount. We're working with the government right now, with the prime minister's office. We're really sitting on, Excel sheets, trying to vision what we really need. We are speaking of at least hundreds of millions of dollars. We have good benchmark from what Singapore is doing. A really terrific job. Also last week, the UAE just announced a national food tech plan with the amount of about $230 million. So I think that's a ballpark we aim to see. Some things don't require any governmental funding, or not a lot of it, like regulation. It's just something that you have to do, and it's relatively low in spend. Other things like infrastructure and financing of scientific research, we don't want to have a small amount spent next year. We want to have a long-term, maybe 5 to 10 year strategy to make sure that in this global race that we are seeing worldwide, Israel maintains its position. It's easy to begin with, compete. We have Singapore and Israel, relatively small countries. But now with the Biden administration, with the EU taking notice of this field, with China and other giants, they're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, I'm sure, at the long run on alternative proteins. So for a small country like Israel to be leading the race, we need to be very sure in how we spend the limited dollars that the government has, and that's what we're working on. It will take a few more months, but I'm sure that we will get there soon.
Yeah, it's great to hear. And looking at the Israel Innovation Authority, which is the government fund, and from your report, they've invested more than 7 companies in this space. Can you talk about some of their choices and maybe talk about some of those companies if you can, if they're public with that yet?
Yeah, so the Innovation Authority is really, I don't know if it's politically correct to be in love within the government authority, but I'm really excited with everything they do. It's really spot on. They have a vision to make the Israeli industry one of the most advanced worldwide, and they act to make sure that we have financing for innovation all across the value chain. So it begins with scientific research that they fund. So an Israeli scientist who wants to research alternative protein can apply for funding with the Innovation Authority. They fund startups, incubators, and then the go-to-market process, and even the infrastructure of big manufacturing plants. So all across the way. And they also support us with regards to regulation and working with other governments. And I think even though we've seen 7 and maybe more to date now in terms of investments, we really have them on the hook now in terms of support for alternative proteins. So I think we can expect maybe a tenfold in their investment in the field in the next 5 years or so. Maybe the most exciting thing that they do with regards to Israel that is different from other things worldwide is the government food tech incubators, like the Kitchen Incubator and Fresh Start, which have built a name for themselves as some of the leaders worldwide. From the Kitchen Incubator, again, 85% government funded. We've seen numerous companies coming out like Aleph Farms, which have created the first cultivated steak, which is, by the way, based on the PhD work of G5 Israel's senior scientist, Dr. Tom Ben-Arian, which is exciting. But we've also seen companies like Zero Egg making a plant-based egg replacement, YoFix, which has done a great job in penetrating the UK market with a porridge product, Real Bite, which are doing minced meat, and I can go on and on. So really terrific job by the Israel Innovation Authority.
Awesome. Can you break down some of the investment numbers in Israel by the different sectors? So what was the number? I think you had a number last year, the overall number of the investment, and let's break it down between the different types.
Yes, so we're seeing immense growth. In 2019, we've seen a growth. We've seen a total investment in Israeli alternative protein of $45 million. In 2020, it grew to $114 million. And already in 2021, I know that we have exceeded this number. Here we are speaking in May. We have, I think, more than $140 million invested in the Israeli native protein sector. If you break down what happened in 2020, we see that out of the $114 million spent in Israel or invested, about 77% have been invested in plant-based foods, 21 in fermentation startups, and the rest, $16 million in cultivated meat companies. And I think that we're going to see, again, immense growth in the coming years. I think that we're going to see a continued trend of this number tripled every year. So I think in 2021, we're going to reach about $300 million by the end of the year, and then perhaps $1 billion in 2022.
When we spoke before, we were like, that investment is still small relatively, but what's really interesting is the growth rate, right? So the growth rate is actually bigger than any other sector, and that's including, second is cybersecurity, other food tech, fintech, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a growth year over year, CAGR of about 150% year over year, which is really, really high. In cyber, food tech, and other causes, we see a growth of up to 50% year over year. So alternative proteins are really booming in Israel in the investment sector. And I think that one additional factor that has to do with it is the fact that Israel is one of the first worldwide in which the public sector can invest in alternative protein through different publicly traded vehicles in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. So for instance, we had Meat Tech, cultivated meat 3D printing company going to market with an IPO as early as 2019, I think. They are now traded in NASDAQ as well for about $100 million and growing. They've also done the first worldwide M&A of cultivated meat companies, acquiring a cultivated fat company from Europe. And then besides IPO, we are seeing something like a SPAC vehicle here in Israel that has been developed by the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, allowing for the public to invest in startups through this vehicle. So we now have about a dozen Israeli startups traded, alternative protein startups traded publicly. And this is a global phenomena which allows the injection of more capital rapidly into the innovation market. And I think it's very interesting because it's a global phenomena. Perhaps Israeli startups have an opportunity to really change their strategy of growth instead of having to go and grow slowly, step by step, in a way that the VC world dictates. The Israeli startups have an ability to raise billions of dollars through the stock exchange and act as maybe a consolidator. We are seeing that the alternative protein ecosystem worldwide is very fragmented yet. And of course, it's still booming and growing and doubling its size every couple of years. I think that at the end of the day, we're going to see some consolidation in the market. And it could be either the big food companies like Nestle, Tyson, Cargill, acquiring a lot of startups and technologies and building the products of the future, which will be a combination of a lot of different technologies. But another opportunity is to be seeing more startups like Beyond and Impossible Foods growing from startup mode to big and global companies. And the ability, I think, of the Israeli market to launch startups and then inject hundreds of millions of dollars into them, allowing them to act as a facilitator through an M&A strategy is something really exciting that I'm looking forward to see how it will develop in the coming years.
In a way, sort of leapfrogging that investment that they need to make a faster impact. And that's what we want, right? We can't have these companies doing it slowly based on
Exactly.
the sustainability challenge that we have.
You know, GFI is in a very unique position as a global non-profit organization that is working both with governments, the academic sector, and the for-profit sector. We work with most of the players in the business sector. It could be startups, big food companies, pharma and agri companies, etc. And it allows us to see from within that a lot of different players in this field that want to change the world as soon as possible because they are aware of the challenges that we discussed at the beginning of our conversation. They are all tackling the same challenges and they are having a very difficult time finding ways to collaborate with each other because of the financial structure and the competitive structure of the field being built by startups nowadays, funded by VCs who are taking a huge risk. So I think finding ways for the different players worldwide to be able to collaborate with each other. It could be through an M&A strategy, it could be through licensing, it could be in many different ways. It just has to happen. I think it will happen in the next few years. And I think that the ones who will be the first to really understand how to collaborate in this very complicated, technology complicated field will be the winners of the future. We are waiting to see who is the next iPhone or Samsung of our field, who will be the consolidator of the different technologies emerging into the market and really being the tipping point at which alternative proteins are starting to get on the curve, which make it no longer an alternative.
Yeah. And in a way, it's kind of like, you know, the sort of P&G or the Unilever of the world, but as a alternative protein company being that new figurehead of a company.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really surprised that we're not seeing it anywhere worldwide. We are seeing even the bigger companies that have emerged, Impossible Foods, Beyond, and others, even Nestle. We haven't seen a lot of licensing and M&A activity in between players. Perhaps it's because the field is so booming that it's not so difficult for companies to raise money nowadays, so they can continue the trajectory of growing independently. But eventually it has to happen because the foods of the future that we want to manufacture, we want foods that are doing biomimicry, that are creating the same experience that we get from it and even better. We want them to be tastier. We want them to be costing the same or less. We want the whole experience to be better. It's a complicated drill to do with so many different types of food, of animal-derived foods. Egg has so many different uses in food, and meat is so hard to really replicate. So the combination of the different players is essential for this theory of change to really come to life.
Yeah. Can you talk about the theory of change? Is something that is driven from the GFI HQ?
Yeah. Maybe I should have begun with that. But, you know, I think it's very simple at the end. Humanity knows what are the challenges that producing meat the way we do in the past few decades raises. We've talked about sustainability, global health, food security, animal welfare. Everyone knows it to a certain extent. And yet it doesn't really, the fact that we know those challenges doesn't really change consumer behavior worldwide, not at the pace that we want to see it. And the question is, how can you really change this global food system to make it more sustainable, healthy, and just? And I think that the alternative protein theory of change is saying, let's give consumers what they want, because most consumers will not change their food behavior because you give them foods that are more sustainable or more nutritious or kinder to animals. Most people have a hard day that they have to go through. Food traditions are very hard to change. And for us to be able to really answer the needs of those consumers around the world, we need to give them what they want, which is biomimicry of the foods that they get from animals, just making them in different ways, creating them from plants or from cells using cellular agriculture and fermentation.
Yeah, me personally, I choose more of the plant-based and the whole foods approach, but I can see the point of like people who have traditionally been eating and consuming meat. It's hard to switch those, so therefore the cell-based approach. There has been debates, obviously, like ethical debates around that. How do you address that yourself, like personally, and also as an organization?
We have the facts in front of us. The global animal agriculture is about to double between 2005 to 2050. Consumption is on the rise of animals, and I'm sure that everyone who's listening to our conversation knows and cares about it. And the question is, how can we make the change? Are plant-based foods enough at the moment? No. We need cultivated meat. We need a big arsenal of technologies and opportunities to be able to create this global revolution that we are all after. With regards to cultivated meat, it's taking one cell or a few cells from an animal without really harming it. And that's it. The animals are not ever being hurt again. You can see this beautiful video by Just of them eating chicken breast and then the chicken running next to them, the actual chicken the cells were taken from.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it.
I think it's also important to know that most startups have ended that stage of their development. So all of the cells that they need, at least in Israel, they have them already. Now it's just a matter of creating delicious foods out of them. But the stage of taking the cells from animals is in general behind us.
From just that one little test tube,
yeah.
Right? You could feed, how much was it? Was it the whole of Israel or was it?
All of Israel, yeah.
Whole of Israel, right. So can you highlight, I know we've spoken about a lot of the startups already coming out of Israel. Can you highlight a few that you'd like to mention?
I'd like to mention all of them, but I'm sure we won't have enough time. We have about 50 startups that are over the radar now here in Israel, known to the public. And then we are seeing about 20 or 30 startups coming to life in the next few months here in Israel. So they account for about 6, 7, 8% of the global alternative protein startups, depending how you count. A few that you can mention, first of all, Israel is a global hub in terms of cultivated meat. So besides Aleph Farm, which creates steaks that we mentioned, we have Super Meat creating cultivated chicken, and they have opened a pilot restaurant recently. Here in Israel, we have Future Meat who are creating cultivated fat, and they have delicious products which I enjoyed tasting as well. And again, MeatTech, who are traded on NASDAQ. In terms of, and we also have cultivated dairy companies also traded here in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, and more to come with regards to seafood, I think, in the next year. In terms of fermentation, Israel is second in the world only to the US in terms of the number of companies of fermentation derived products. One company that I can mention is called Remilk. They are creating dairy products, different cheeses using yeast fermentation. And then in terms of plant-based, we have a few very nice companies that are doing 3D printing of plant-based foods. One of them that I really like is RealBite. They have delicious products, and they're building their first factory nowadays. They're about to launch the product to market this July. They're creating very juicy and delicious steak, which I think is going to make a lot of headlines worldwide once it's out. And I can go on, but really a lot of exciting products and companies.
We are from Israel, a tiny country with not a lot of land, not a lot of resources. How can we become a global leader? By innovating, by continuing to develop new approaches, new technologies, new products, and very effectively bring them to all the people around the world.
The demand today comes from consumers who are looking for ethical products that are sustainable and healthier. We are bringing a better option to the world.
How we do it? We take the same elements that make meat, protein, fat, molecules that give you flavor, and compile them into a delicious food product instead of in a cow, in a 3D printer. It can be healthy, it can be from plants.
Up until now, they didn't have the option to replace eggs because they were lacking the functionality or the taste and texture. So Zero Eggs brings to the table a solution, a variety of very tasty, nutritious, plant-based dishes without using eggs.
In Israel, we have two unique combinations. One, it's a risk-taking society. So when we started with our science fiction idea, people told us, it's crazy, go for it. And the second thing, the government is extremely supportive in doing what we're doing.
Us as Israeli people, we are people that like to share and to exchange ideas and to have brainstorms together. So this kind of community really helps us grow together as food tech companies.
And this allows Israel today to be a leader in the alternative protein space. It's more healthy, no cholesterol, no saturated fat, much more fiber.
So you get the good that you have in eggs without animal cruelty and without harming the environment.
What you save in eating a single steak of redefined meat is equivalent to all of the showers you take in a year. It's equivalent to driving across Israel in your car. You can deliver impact by eating really tasty meat. So it's a win-win for everybody.
In one bag, you have the equivalent of 259 eggs.
Once we understand as an industry how cultural and how emotional meat is, and how this relates to deliciousness, to how tasty it is, the rest is easy.
Pushing the food industry forward and really changing the way we are eating today.
When you eat food, when you feel it, when you put it in your body, the science fiction becomes reality.
I think the 3D printing innovation is fascinating as well. Like not only just for food tech, but also for, material science, right? And cost of producing materials is going to be slashed. And I know a lot of the airlines who faced difficulties, especially last year, due to COVID, have been actually changing their manufacturing models to include 3D printing because the cost of producing it is a lot less. So I guess that's working the same way, but really to build the scaffolding of those meats.
Yeah, I think in 3D printing and food, because foods are something that we consume every day at a relatively low price, the 3D printing companies have to convince their investors and the public that they can manufacture food at scale in the right price parity. So this is the challenge that they will have to overcome, but I think they can tackle it.
Yeah. What's been your background to get to where you are today?
Again, I think so many things had to happen for me to be here speaking with you from the position of leading G5's effort in Israel. A few anecdotes is that I used to be an IP lawyer working with patents, and I was hired by the Israeli animal industry before I was eating a plant-based diet to represent one of their cases in front of the Israeli Supreme Court. And that's where I was really, for the first time, revealed with all the information and the magnitude of this industry. And I remember sitting at the Israeli Supreme Court and feeling very embarrassed that this is what I'm doing. I'm trying slowly understanding what I feel about this industry. And I remember the lawyer of the other side, the opponent, entering the Supreme Court, escorted by his son. And I looked at him and I said, you know what, I want to be able to have my kids proud of me when I'm older, when I have kids. Now I do. And I have to work for a cause that I believe in, and I can't continue representing things that I don't. So that was a very monumental moment for me.
Do you remember what specifically made you also change your diet and, really care more about sustainability and animal welfare, etc.? Do you remember what was a trigger point for you?
Yes, so I think you're right calling it a trigger point, because I think it was inherently in me for years, but I didn't find it, going vegan, a very masculine thing to do in a very, in the Israeli society that is it's a very masculine way to go about things with regards to diet and meat and consumption, I think so many different things had to happen.
Do you remember you watching a documentary or something like that helped you change?
I was actually friend at law school with founded an Israeli organization called Vegan Friendly. Through this friendship, I got introduced to the field, to the industry, to plant-based diets, the idea. It took me a few years since I got to know him, to really inhale it and understand what's behind it. I was very cynical at first for the idea, but slowly, eventually I met with them and we had a good discussion, and I decided to gradually go plant-based, and I've been eating a plant-based diet for about 6 years now.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think, going back to the masculine side that you mentioned, I think films like The Game Changers, I think, was ultimately sort of pushed for those people who thought that you can't be strong on a plant-based diet, right? To prove the point otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. So many good things are happening lately with regards to film. We have now Seaspiracy on Netflix making headlines worldwide. I see the change it's causing in Israel, and I'm sure around the world as well. So definitely movies have a lot to do with it. I think that podcasts and interviews, there are so much different mediums that you can consume this type of information from. And I think all of us together, the plant-based ecosystem that has evolved worldwide, we're really together jointly making the change.
Yeah. How do you think other countries can get their head of state to be passionate about removing animal agriculture, to create protein with a compassion?
Yeah, they can call me. And
awesome.
No, it is a long process, and first of all, we were able to do it thanks to a G5 family of donors who allowed us to create a very deep research with regards to what's happening in Israel, what is the financial opportunity, strategic opportunity for Israel as a country. This is what we presented to the Prime Minister. And I think another factor that helped convince him is because Israel is a very significant population of plant-based eaters. We have about 5% vegan, about 8 to 12% who are vegetarians, and then about a third flexitarians. So it's, at the end of the day, it's a political power. Imagine having almost 20% of the population wanting advancements in plant-based foods. Prime Minister takes it into account.
Yeah, for sure. And I do hope other leaders will enable the same level of finance, regulation, policy, changes to manufacturing to make it happen faster as well.
Yeah, I hope President Biden will be the next head of state with a cultivated steak. I think we're not so far away from it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Nir, great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise, and all the best, and hopefully see you again soon.
Yeah, see you soon. All right, thanks so much.